Let's pick up on this conversation now. Recovering stolen goods during the unrest is underway in some parts of Gauteng and KwaZulu-Natal. The looting of businesses, shopping centers and warehouses in the country last week will cost billions, we've been told. Police officers have been going back to various communities to try and recover the stolen property. Joining me now is criminologist Guy Lamb, who has written extensively on the psychology of looting in South Africa. He joins us from Cape Town. Guy, good morning to you. Thank you very much for making time to talk to us. As I speak to you, we have been beaming visuals of police officers going door to door in the area of Sebokeng here in Gauteng. It's important to preface my question with the fact that looting cannot be condoned, and so if you have stolen property, you obviously will have to give it back. In fact, in all probability, be arrested as well. But law enforcement officers, according to our reporter, they have been going house to house, breaking locks where some people are not even around, and taking goods that perhaps in their eyes will be seen as brand new and not having been opened. What proof is there, Guy, that these are stolen property? Can law enforcement demonstrate that this is stolen property that they are taking back, or is it actually illegal what they are doing?
Well, that's a very good question. I mean, we sort of start with the looting, and the looting was quite extensive. And now there's an effort and an attempt by the state to kind of demonstrate its power and authority and trying to go and recover those goods and arrest the individuals who perpetrated it. But in the general scheme of things, the law enforcement are only going to really hit the sort of tip of the iceberg, and they really want to demonstrate that they are doing something to the public, but they're never going to get down to the bottom of holding everyone who looted to account. But going to your question, it's around, how legal is this? Well, I think what's happening at the moment is they're sort of taking an opportunity. Some of it doesn't appear to be following the letter of the law, because you have to have pretty strong evidence that the property that you are entering, that there are stolen goods in that property, and you would need to have documentation to prove that. So, for example, if it was electronic goods, you would need serial numbers, and then you'd be able to determine, based on the documentation, if you have those electronic goods have been stolen. I mean, obviously, if there are barcodes on the goods that have been accumulated in a particular premises, and you've got those particular barcodes, and you can prove that they were stolen, then there is, possibly it's legal, but, breaking locks and entering a property, maybe you have, there is reports that there's suspicion of stolen property there, but the problem here is that the police and law enforcement can undermine the whole process by doing this, because they open themselves up for legal cases against them, and it can essentially undermine the whole process. But I think what they're probably banking on here is that these are poorer communities who don't necessarily have the resources to take them to court, to initiate legal proceedings. So I think that's what they're doing, kind of trying to demonstrate that there will be accountability, but can undermine it in the medium to long term.
And that's just the point that you've touched on, Guy, that I want to go back to. You talk about legal recourse. What legal recourse would a person who stays in an informal dwelling, who stays in a shack, versus a person who lives in a suburban area, probably has money to take law enforcement to court in order to prove that they either didn't steal this and that now property has been damaged because perhaps law enforcement got into their homes and they were not there? I'm simply saying, what legal recourse, or where can a poor person go to try and prove that they are not a guilty party, and to add to their misery of living in a shack, it's been broken into by law enforcement who claim that they were there to seize stolen property?
I mean, in circumstances where it's out of the context of what's happened in KwaZulu-Natal, where there was fairly widespread looting in parts of Gauteng, normally where you've had cases where law enforcement have been heavy-handed and broken into shacks. I mean, for example, we saw within Cape Town around land invasions and an individual who was treated really badly by law enforcement, allegedly. And then, of course, civil society and law firms got involved in providing legal support to that person so that legal action could be taken against law enforcement. In the case of, obviously, what's happened in KwaZulu-Natal, there, in cases where it seems that the individual communities have been involved in looting, there might not be such support from civil society to provide the legal assistance, but that's mean, most poor South Africans who live in informal settlements, they're looking for legal support. They largely depend on assistance from civil society organizations or from law firms who will provide legal support pro bono. But given the nature of the looting, I think it's going to be a lot less easy to, or it's going to be much more difficult to find that kind of support. Whereas someone from a middle-class community who has access to resources, that their chances of securing, kind of some form of compensation from the police through legal process is much higher.
You've written, Guy, on the psychology of looting, and you have written about the recent events as well. And you say that a number of narratives have emerged that are being seen as the drivers of the looting that we saw happening. Tell us about those drivers. What are the drivers of people going out and doing what they did?
Sure. I mean, so there have been a number of narratives here, and what we do know about looting, and this is, I've only done studies around xenophobic violence with a number of colleagues, and looting in relation to spaza shops and what happens when there's xenophobic violence and looting, is, looting doesn't happen spontaneously. It mostly happens during civil unrest, sometimes during natural disasters, but that's not often. It's usually during civil disturbances in very specific areas, usually where there's sort of high crime areas or there's kind of a lack of kind of effective community leadership and counterbalances around adherence to the rule of law. So what we're seeing with kind of looting and sort of motivations here is it often happens in poorer communities, but poverty is not the main driver of this. It's usually about looting will happen if there is a sort of a strong message from certain influential people that surround you, or people who you kind of value or see value in what they have to say, encouraging you to loot. But usually, the words and the messages aren't sufficient. Often you need groups of individuals who are living in your area or groups of people who live near you who initiate the process and start the process. So usually it's going to be a group of people, usually kind of younger men who are at the forefront of doing the looting, and then it builds its own momentum and other people join in. Yeah. And of course, when other people join in, it's about some are motivated by hunger and desperation, as we've seen. Some parts are sort of food riots, but normally those people wouldn't have engaged in food riots without these sort of circumstances being in place. Mm-hmm. And then we've seen, people with means participating in the looting and going to warehouses and helping themselves to various forms of goods and products. And the kind of motivation here is once the momentum is going, others join in because, the sort of group dynamic provides camouflage, that if you go in mass, in large numbers, your chances of being arrested are very low. Yeah. You know that the police aren't going to be able to stop you if you go in and there's in a large crowd. So there's those who, planned it and, saw this as a means of protesting, of demonstrating frustration, of demonstrating anger, of insurrection. And the others who just joined in for opportunistic reasons. And, it's an opportunity to get this sort of stuff. So it is about that, it is a group dynamic, and within the group dynamic, people often have different norms, and it's the sense of, other people are doing it, so we join in too. But of course, there's others within the communities who don't do it, who sort of say this is unacceptable and we're not going to participate. So it's not everyone who does it, but it really it depends on so many different factors, and it varies from community to community.
I'm quite interested in what you said a little earlier in this very answer, that poverty is not the driver. Yet there has been a very strong sentiment that it is in part, or in large part at least, driven by the economic or socio-economic circumstances that poor people find themselves in. And you couple that with the strong narrative from government, right at the very top, the president, who says this was an attempted overthrow of a democratically elected government. Connect those two strands for me, if you can, and again take us back to why perhaps it has started this whole issue of looting.
Well, if we come to your question about poverty, in particular poverty and hunger, for example, as vast majority of hungry and poor people don't loot. I think what we've seen within KwaZulu-Natal is the sort of messaging and discourse was quite strong around. And this is where the sort of point I made in the conversation article about something called brokerage, where you've seen these instigators and orchestrators at different levels who have kind of providing some sort of justification and motivation and saying, engage in looting because you're owed something, because you've been treated this way, because the government has kind of not done something about your desperate situation. And, some people will buy into that messaging, and particularly if it's kind of a concentrated group of people, and then it builds on from there. Then your question about, is this an attack against democracy? It's a tricky one because, sort of an attack against democracy would be, you would see sort of a rebel group formed and that they would try and attack, the union buildings in Pretoria. They would attack police stations, go for military bases, and those would be kind of clear indications of insurrection. What's happened here is I think there were some insurrectionist tendencies and insurrectionist objectives on the part of the instigators where they wanted to, ultimately would like to seize control of government, maybe to kind of do that through the ruling party, so kind of a faction that's not dominant to seize control of the party. I think maybe that was one of their objectives. But implementing that, they don't have the individuals, they don't have the strategy. So all they could do is, as other analysts have spoken about, is weaponize poverty, weaponize inequality. And that's what we've seen. The sense of Iran, it just led to destruction, it led to looting, it led to acts of economic sabotage where, they didn't have the forces on the ground, they didn't have the kind of numbers to do that. But it's not to say that they don't have a longer-term plan, and that's something today we've seen, obviously, intelligence reports being produced and, being reported in News 24 about possibilities of police stations being targeted for weapons. And, of course, we've got this, large amount of ammunition that's gone missing in KZN, mainly handgun ammunition, which is the most prolific weapon illegally held within KwaZulu-Natal. So there are a number of moving parts here that we still need to keep an eye on.
Yeah. Guy Lamb, thank you very much for your insights. A criminologist talking to us about the psychology of looting. Thanks indeed for your time.